Welcome to an online video in our course Empirical Research Methods in IT and Visualization. The difference between primary and secondary data is crucial in empirical research. This video will help you understand what they are and when to use each type. In short, primary data and sources are first-hand data generated by you as researcher, while secondary data and sources are already generated and interpreted by others by the time you use them. Primary sources are first-hand narratives, original documents, objects, or factual accounts. They are created during or close to the event or period and have a direct connection to a person, time, event, or place. Most importantly, primary data have not been subject to processing, manipulation, analysis, or interpretation. On the other hand, secondary sources and data are already interpreted, analyzed versions of someone else's primary data. They therefore provide a second-hand version of events or an interpretation of first-hand accounts. Primary sources can tell a more generalized story, one or more steps removed from the original person, time, place, or event. These are some examples of the types of sources we often use in empirical research. Pause the video, study the list, and write down what type of data you think each is an example of. I will show the answers at the end of the video. This figure shows the main difference between primary and secondary data through a hypothetical example. Primary data in the form of a detailed log shown in the table to the left is what the first researcher uses in his research. He generated the data, for instance, from some sensors, analyzed it, and now presents it in a format for others to understand. His presentation of the data is shown in the graph in the middle. This presentation is used by the second researcher. However, this time the presentation will act as secondary data for her. This is because the first researcher has already interpreted the data, maybe in the process has omitted some outlier values. He has translated the data into his conceptual model of the phenomenon and presented them in a specific way. There are many steps in this process that the first and the second researcher might disagree. It might even be the case that if the data in the table were given to the second researcher, she would have produced a different presentation. This is why it is important for our research that we distinguish between primary and secondary data, and that we strive to document as well as possible how and who has interpreted the data before us. This is because the validity of the secondary data and its relevance for our own research depends on the first researcher and his interpretation. So where and how do we use the two different types of data in Oates et al.'s framework? Secondary data is often used before we have generated our own primary data. We need to start somewhere, and we often start with a literature review. Literature can be regarded as secondary data. Once our research is started, we will generate our own primary data through our selected data generation methods. Of course, this division is not strict. We might decide to generate primary data while we are defining our conceptual framework and our research question. For instance, we might want to interview some experts to understand their opinions about the topic. We might also use secondary data, documents, and research literature in our primary study. This is, for instance, the case when our research study is to do a systematic literature review. So the division here is only an approximation which needs to be re-examined case by case. Here you can see the answers to our quiz. As you can see, data that are undergone interpretation are labeled as secondary. For instance, a documentary is often based on the interpretation of the director who wishes to tell a story. The same is true for the writer of the encyclopedia who wants to create the most generic text and definitions. The examples that are labeled primary, on the other hand, represent data that have not undergone much interpretation. For instance, a news article from an event that happened the day before will most probably contain some empirical facts about the event. The same is true about field notes from a study, which are often written intentionally with minimum interpretation. The last example shows a combination where the review of the literature can be labeled as secondary, while preliminary findings presented in a conference can be labeled as primary. At the end, we should remind ourselves that it is not possible to have data that are not interpreted at all. So we can look at these two types of data as ideal types and take this into consideration when evaluating the validity of our results. The research design framework we used in this video is taken from our course textbook, Researching Information Systems and Computing by Brioni, Oates et al. We also use Catherine Dawson's excellent book, 100 Activities for Teaching Research Methods, to show you some examples of primary and secondary data. This session is part of our course IT 3010 and DT 8111. To learn more about these courses, go to the links provided in the QR codes in this slide.